Welcome back, one and all, to the podcast. We have a really fun one here for you today. This is going to be a solo episode, a quick one. We talked about running backs quite a bit last week on the show. Coming out of that, I think we realized there's so much to talk about with this running back class, and honestly, not enough time to talk about it. And so I finally got the spreadsheet, the infamous spreadsheet, filled out. I've got all the data input into the sheet compared with previous classes. I have, let's see here. I think I have 2022 through 2025 in here. So we've got the last three classes. Plus, I've got in some benchmarks like Saquon Barkley and Christian McCaffrey just to give us an idea for what really good prospects look like in this model. And honestly, the model, it's nothing special. We're just looking at how important were some of these prospects to their team. So we've got like the percentage of team offensive yards, percentage of team offensive touchdowns, a little bit of receiving stuff in here as well, and draft capital. Draft capital is really important. A few other, metrics that I tend to like dominator rating, PFF grade, things like that, all thrown into the spreadsheet, and it spits out a number and, theoretically tells you how good these players are going to be for fantasy football. I think with, doing spreadsheet stuff like this, you obviously can't really quantify like a film grade, like an eyeball test for some of these prospects. And so anytime you're looking at data, it's got to be like one data point in your overall process. I like to combine the spreadsheet with what my eyes tell me to get like a final, clear-eyed view for what these prospects are going to end up being. But all of that aside, I have the prospects in the spreadsheet, and I now can see where these guys theoretically from an analytical side stack up to past classes. And in a lot of ways, it's really interesting. And some of the stuff that we've been saying about the 2025 class is true. This is a very, very strong class, at least on paper. And I say it with the caveat of on paper. This is, I think, the most well-rounded class in terms of the last few classes, at least since we've been doing this show, where you're going down the list and there's really interesting data points to point to for why certain players are going to be really good. You've got a lot of really dominant running backs in this class. You've got running backs that have stayed in college and performed really, really well. You've got running backs that broke out early, like Quinshon Judkins, for example. He's not going to pop in this spreadsheet because if you're taking his most recent season, it's not ridiculous in terms of the numbers, but also you take into account he's sharing a backfield with another elite running back prospect. And, oh yeah, he had 1,500 yards as a freshman in the SEC. That's crazy. So you have some numbers that you kind of have to take into some wider context. But at the same time, we have a lot of really intriguing running back prospects in this draft. I sent the list to Landon and Ben the other day once I finished it. And of the top 7 guys, including our benchmarks, Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley, of the top 7 since 2022's class, 5 of them are 2025 prospects. So kind of let that sink in for a moment with what we're dealing with. This class, at least, again, I say it with the caveat, on paper, this class looks really, really good with some projected draft capital in there as well. So I'm excited, and I thought it would just be a nice little exercise to go through this class in a little bit more detail than we did on kind of the survey show and talk about some of these guys and see how they stack up with previous classes. Let's start here at the top. We talked about Ashton Jeanty quite a bit, and for good reasons, right? Ashton Jeanty's profile in a lot of ways is an anomaly. You're looking at somebody that has production, not just his senior season, but his junior season. I took his 2023 season and I stacked it up to his 2024 season. His 2023 season would have been like the fourth best season, fourth best on this sheet since 2022, including Christian McCaffrey, including Saquon Barkley. Okay. That's not the season that he just had, though, where he had 2,600 yards and almost won the Heisman Trophy. That season where he had 2,600 yards, almost won the Heisman Trophy, put him at the highest grade in this entire spreadsheet, and it's rated from 1 to 100. He's the only prospect that has a 90-plus score. He's got a 91. Nobody else has crossed that 90 threshold, and we have 39 names in here. So we're looking at an extremely elite prospect in terms of analytics. We also factor in draft capital here. I'm anticipating, based on everything that we've seen about him, he's going to be a top 10 pick. That could change, and obviously if his draft capital changes where he's not a top 10 pick, and you're looking at somebody that instead is a first rounder, just like a generic first rounder who knows where he goes, he's still above a 90. He's still the highest graded prospect in this whole deal. So I would imagine what we're getting with Genty is, just based on the numbers, they're absurd. His percentage of team offensive yards and touchdowns are ridiculous. His dominator rating is ridiculous. And two, I think the other thing, and we mentioned this on the survey show, his yards per route run in 2023 was the highest of any running back in any single season that I've graded. He had over a 3 yards per route run. He had over 500 yards receiving. This past year, he had 0.5 because they didn't use him as a receiver. He still had like 120 yards receiving, I think, but they just didn't use him that way. They used him as a runner. So Ashton Genty, like, it's absurd, and I think the analytics probably overly weight how he should be valued. I don't think he needs to be valued like the best running back prospect since 2017. I think that's probably a bit excessive. I think Saquon Barkley is coming out of college. Saquon Barkley, in my mind, is the most complete and easy to project as an elite fantasy producer, like on day one. He doesn't grade as high as some other guys on this sheet just because you're taking into context the numbers. You're looking at raw data and you're saying, how's this going to translate to fantasy football? So Saquon is not at the top of the list, but you know, when you compare the numbers plus the eyeball test, you go, oh yeah, okay, he's going to be insane. So Ashton Genty's really high. The other one, we talked about him a little bit in the preview show. And I think after doing this exercise, I'm going to be really, really high on Caleb Johnson. And I know Ben is moderately high on Caleb Johnson. It's hard to put in perspective what producing the way he did at Iowa, like how impressive that is. He had 57% of Iowa's touchdowns last year, and he had 40% of their yards. Ashton Genty was incredible, right? 2,600 yards. He had 42% of his team's yards. Caleb Johnson had 1,725 total yards. Iowa only had 4,200 total yards as a team. They only scored 40 touchdowns as a team. Caleb Johnson had 23 of those. Like, taking the raw numbers, 1,700 yards, 23 touchdowns, like, that's impressive by itself. But when you put into context that he did it on a team that is anemic offensively, at least year over year, like, they had 1,700 yards passing last year. Okay? This is a team that was incredibly one note. They could only run the ball, and they did it really well. Caleb Johnson, that offensive line, mauled people, but they couldn't throw at all with Cade McNamara and whoever else was back there. 1,700 yards passing. That's terrible. So you kind of take everything into context. He didn't run an elite 40, but he has a profile that says he should be really good, and he was really good on a team that, frankly, let's be honest, their offense kind of sucked. And I think you just have to kind of factor that in and say, that's impressive. You get the projected draft capital. I think by all accounts, he's going to be a late first rounder, maybe an early second rounder. So he's going to get adequate draft capital there. I'm not worried about the 40. It doesn't bother me at all that he ran I think it was a high 4.5, maybe a low 4.6. He's huge. He's got a ridiculous numbers profile. He scores higher on the sheet than Christian McCaffrey did coming out of college. Obviously, they do things different ways, but when you have a dominator rating as high as he's got the highest dominator rating of any prospect, including, Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley, of anybody coming out in the last 4+ years. He's got a 48% dominator rating. And dominator rating, for those who don't know, that is your percentage of your team's offensive touchdowns, your percentage of your team's offensive yards combined into one number. It's basically, like you would imagine, how important was this player to his team's entire success. I think Caleb Johnson was incredibly important and just a ridiculous prospect in terms of analytics. The other one here, he's the 5th best graded guy on this whole sheet. And while Caleb Johnson is somebody that scores really high and it makes me think, oh, okay, probably going to be really good. Cam Skattebo, I think probably the numbers skew him a little bit too far into the good. He comes in just behind Bijan Robinson as a prospect and ahead of Breece Hall. Like, that's the sandwich we're making right now. I'm not sure that I'm there yet on Cam Skattebo. I think he's very interesting, and there's data points you can point to say, I think he could be really good. But I think the NFL is going to tell us a lot about Cam Skattebo. The thing with him is he's got 38% of Arizona State's offensive yards last year, 42% of their touchdowns. He's got nearly 2 yards per route run, 40% dominator rating. And the other thing here, too, that's really interesting with him is he scored really high in missed tackles forced per attempt, meaning he's elusive. So you combine all these things together, you've got a guy that's really intriguing, but I'm not sure that these raw numbers tell us the entire story of Cam Skattebo. I think the eyeball test says, yep, really good. The numbers say, yep, really good. I'm just curious what the NFL is going to say about him. Is he somebody that slips into the 3rd round? Is he somebody that goes in the 2nd round? I think that draft capital and that landing spot will be really important for him. He does remind me of like a short James Conner. He's a mauler. And I'm just curious like how that archetype translates into the NFL. I think if you end up in a right situation for him, like Pittsburgh to me screams Cam Skattebo, and maybe it's just, the obvious, he's a mauler, they like maulers, great. But I could also see him being like a relatively inefficient thumper in the NFL, and I just don't know how it translates to fantasy. So he's really interesting. The numbers are incredible, but I think you kind of put an asterisk next to it just because who knows, right? Omarion Hampton, we talked about him. Again, we are talking about guys right now. I'm sitting at number 7 on the total sheet, right? And we've already talked about 3 guys. We're going into number 4. This is the 7th best. Omarion Hampton scores really high because I think you're getting a 1st-round pick with Omarion Hampton, so the draft capital is really good. But also, even more than that, he dominated at North Carolina, wore people out. Really good, like adequate as a pass catcher. And I think we noted this in the show. Like, he might not be an amazing pass catcher, but he's adequate, really good at it, I would say. It'll just depend on how the NFL decides to use him. And I do think draft capital will be really important for him. I really have no worries about Omarion Hampton. He's coming in here, like he grades higher than Saquon on this list, which maybe it says something about the algorithm that Saquon is a little bit lower. But, if you go back and look at Saquon's, yardages, it wasn't obscene. It was very good, but it wasn't absurd or anything like that. So Omarion Hampton's a guy that, like, lock him in. I have no reservations. I think with him, the eye test and the analytics test both agree he's great. He's going to be really good. So no worries about him. The guy comes in right behind him. This was interesting. The guy that comes in right behind him is R.J. Harvey from UCF. I liked R.J. Harvey on tape. He impressed me coming in at a Big 12 school, a smaller school, right? You think of UCF, you think of a non-Power 5 team. They're in the Big 12 now, so that's interesting. He has just absurd dominator numbers here. He's got 52% of his team's offensive touchdowns, 34% of their yards. He's also really solid as a pass catcher. And he's pretty elusive, and PFF really likes him. The thing with him is going to be, where's he get drafted? I have him projected as a 4th-round pick, and he's got this score because the numbers are ridiculous, right? He's got, like, all the spreadsheet stuff says R.J. Harvey's going to be electric. I am curious what the NFL tells us about R.J. Harvey. I think right now, based on stuff like this, exercises like this, he's my sleeper pick. I'm not sure that he gets taken in a lot of first rounds of rookie drafts today or any first rounds of rookie drafts, but I think you're looking at early, mid, second round picks. RJ Harvey's probably a guy I'm taking shots on. I don't know if it's a called shot yet, but we'll see what the NFL says. The analytics of RJ Harvey say you're looking at a Kenneth Walker, Chase Brown, Rashad White type prospect. And obviously those different guys have different outcomes. But I think you're looking at somebody that, like, if he gets the opportunity in the NFL, his profile says he's going to be really good. Let's jump down here to a couple names. Dylan Sampson, Devin Neal, and then also Raheem Sanders. So there's quite a few guys that come in as like average players in terms of their, spreadsheet statistics. They're spreadsheet warriors, I guess. Dylan Sampson scored a lot of touchdowns at Tennessee. He had sort of run-of-the-mill percentages in terms of his percent of teams' production outside of scoring. His dominator rating is fine. He's not especially elusive, but he's adequately elusive. I kind of view him as a pretty solid across-the-board kind of prospect. I'm not overly in on him, and I think landing spot probably dictates a lot about where he kind of ends up, and also draft capital. I have him right now for draft capital projected as a 4th-round pick. We will see, obviously. He's intriguing, but I'm not overly excited about Dylan Sampson. I think for me, he looks like a guy that probably is just a rotational back in the NFL, and the numbers kind of back that one up. Devin Neal's also really interesting. He had 4 pretty much back-to-back-to-back seasons that were just really solid. The thing with him is he was never amazing, and I'm curious how the NFL looks at him. He's a guy that played a lot of games in college. He's got, I want to say, 4 straight 1,000-yard seasons, so that's impressive. He's just somebody that I'm not seeing ceiling with all that much, and I've got him projected as a 4th or 5th-round pick in the NFL. I think across the board with him, he's solid. He's not amazing in really any one area. So I'm kind of just curious to see what the NFL tells us about him. I didn't see anything in the numbers that say, yeah, he's going to be especially, great or anything like that. The other guy here is Raheem Sanders. We didn't talk about him at all in the preview. And I think he is interesting, but also the numbers don't say superstar. Now, granted, the numbers here can be skewed by a lot of different factors. But with Raheem Sanders, you've got like adequate percentage of yards and touchdowns, pretty good pass catcher, pretty decent dominator rating, and like also adequate as an elusive runner. He kind of comes out sort of like Devin Neal for me. He's pretty good across the board, not especially great at anything. So again, with him, it'll be interesting to see what the NFL says. I think a couple of years ago, he got a lot of buzz because he had like a 1,500-yard season with Arkansas. And that's really exciting. But then he got injured, and then he goes to South Carolina and is good, but not dominant per se. So again, I will reserve judgment for him to see what the NFL says. The other guy we talked about in the preview show that I'm very intrigued by, but the numbers say maybe not quite as good as we thought. Got to take a sip of coffee there. Was DJ Giddens. The thing with Giddens is he's got 28% of the team's offensive yards, pretty solid. The thing with him is he didn't score. I think he had 8 touchdowns, if I wrote down my numbers correctly. Yeah, he had 1,600 total yards, 8 touchdowns. I think the thing with him is obviously touchdowns are a volatile thing, but you want to see in college guys scoring. And it was very low in terms of like the percentage of teams' touchdowns for him. Not amazing there. Also not an especially great pass catcher in terms of the analytics. So your dominator rating is a little bit lower than you would like. And the pass catching metrics aren't especially amazing. And he's not especially elusive either. He is very interesting, and I think Ben did a good job pointing this out in the preview. I think he has great initial burst, but the more that I have gotten into him, you see he's not like a long speed burner. And so he is not somebody, like he gets run down at the 1, the 2, the 3, the 5 a lot. And I don't know how that translates to the NFL, to tell you the truth. I don't know where that factors into his overall profile. I think you've got a guy that could be a very solid player in the NFL, and yet at the same time, I'm getting Kendre Miller vibes. And, Kendre Miller could still have a pretty decent career, but he hasn't really gotten on the field. Obviously, Alvin Kamara's got a lot to do with that, but I'm not really sure how I feel about Giddens yet. I think Kendre Miller kind of is my barometer because I really liked Kendre Miller coming out, and he just hasn't flashed in the NFL yet. And obviously, situation had a lot to do with that. Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson, I don't want to say too much about them. I think anybody who has looked at their stats can tell you not great. And like if you're just breaking things down on a spreadsheet, but there are things to point to say both of these guys could be extremely, extremely good. In an exercise like this, they're not going to pop because they shared a backfield. But at the same time, they're not the bottom of the list, right? I mean, there's other guys on here like James Cook scored lower. Now, granted, James Cook had an interesting situation in college as well. James Cook, Braylon Allen, Ollie Gordon, Jordan James are all below these two guys on the spreadsheet. Just take that for what it's worth. The eyeball test for these two, I think, is going to play a lot larger role. And also, I do project them with pretty good draft capital. I've got both of them going in the second round. So there's that element too. I don't take a lot of stock in their stats at Ohio State. Ohio State wins the national championship, has a prolific offense, but when you've got two guys splitting a backfield, it's gonna skew these numbers quite a bit. So, they're lower in a spreadsheet, but let your eyeballs tell you what you think about them. I think they're going to be just fine in the NFL. Last couple guys here, Jordan James, Ollie Gordon. So Jordan James from Oregon is somebody that is intriguing to me, but he is also, I think, going to be negatively affected by the fact that he played in Oregon's offense. Oregon scored a bunch of touchdowns this past year. Let's see if I have my numbers correct. He's got 24% of his team's offensive yards, 23% of the team's touchdowns. Not amazing, but like fine. 0.9 yards per route run. Wasn't really used as a pass catcher. The dominator rating isn't great. The peripherals of like pass catching, things like that, aren't especially great. But at the same time, I do float a Bucky Irving comp out there who also from Oregon didn't have especially great numbers because he was playing on an elite team that scored a lot of points, had a ton of yards, and he was kind of a part-time player. I don't say that to say that Jordan James is a Bucky Irving comp. I just say that to say there's some context with his offense and why his on-paper counting stats aren't especially amazing. I'll be curious to see what the NFL says about him too. Everything I'm seeing on him says fine, but nothing says elite. And maybe that's just what he is. A fine prospect, but not anything too especially great. Last one here, Ollie Gordon. He pretty much led college in rushing 2 years ago. Comes back this year instead of going pro and really kind of crapped the bed, I'll be honest with you. Was not great at Oklahoma State this past season. He had let's see here. I think he had 1,000. Here we go. 1,000 yards, 14 touchdowns. 1,000 total yards, 14 touchdowns. Did not hit 1,000 yards rushing. It was not a good year. They kind of crashed out on offense this past year. I think a lot of that is to do with the offensive line stunk. Offense as a whole was pretty terrible this past year for Oklahoma State. So that could be part of the equation there for Ollie Gordon. I don't see anything in these numbers that says anything especially great, and I'm not sure the draft capital is going to be especially great either. I think based on this kind of list, he's a guy I'm probably going to pass on. Yeah, not especially excited about Ollie Gordon. He comes across in the numbers, and even factoring in some of the stuff that he did when he had his 1,500-yard season, he had 1 million carries. He kind of gives me plotter vibes. I'm not sure that you're getting an elite fantasy producer there with Ollie Gordon. Last guy I'll mention, Trevor Etienne. He did not play a lot of the games this year. He dealt with injuries, so his counting numbers are skewed. He is very interesting, though. I think he's like second to last in this list, and it's just because he didn't play enough games. He kind of still grades out as like a Devin Neal, Zach Charbonnet, Tank Bigsby adjacent prospect. I'm intrigued based on landing spot and draft capital, but I think landing spot and draft capital on the flip side of that tell you a lot about what the NFL feels about Trevor Etienne. James Cook also had this same thing where he went to Georgia, was not a full-time player, and was good in like when he was on the field, he looked really good and was pretty solid across the board, but just didn't play enough. And I think that's an issue with Georgia prospects as a whole. They don't play enough. They don't have enough counting stats. So you can't, when you're comparing like percentage of team yards, to other guys that were the offense for their teams, they're going to look a lot worse. And so naturally in a spreadsheet like this, he's not going to score as well. But I do think Trevor Etienne intrigues me more than some of these other guys. Like, I think I'm more interested in him than Jordan James and Ollie Gordon. But that's not also to say that like I'm especially intrigued. Like, I think he's fine. But again, draft capital, landing spot will tell us a lot about what he is. All of that to say, you've got a lot of really intriguing prospects in this 2025 class. I am especially intrigued by, I just did my little count here. I have 6 prospects that I think could be legit fantasy difference makers. And they all have different paths to get there, I think. But doing this exercise, you got the 2 Ohio State running backs that would be great if they had their own teams, had their own backfields, but they had to split that. And then the top 4 guys, Hampton, Scadaboo, Caleb Johnson, and Genty, I think are really, really intriguing prospects. And the 25 class as a whole, I probably should throw RJ Harvey in there too. I think he's got some really good potential. So 7 guys, but the 25 class as a whole grades out incredibly well compared to the last few classes that we've had. And throwing in benchmarks like Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley kind of put things in perspective. Like, those are elite guys that turned into elite fantasy producers at the next level. They were elite in college. Everybody knew they were going to be great. They had good draft capital, these kind of things. I'm just curious to see how things pan out, to see where these guys get drafted and how the NFL feels about them. So that is the quick and the dirty on the running backs. We will be coming at you with a free agency podcast as well this week. So be on the lookout for that. Have a good one, everybody. Like, subscribe, write us a review. Give us a 5-star review. Helps us in the algorithm. All those things help us in the algorithm. Appreciate y'all. Have a good one. We will see you in the next episode.